On behalf of the Beacon House School System, the organizer of the School of Tomorrow events, I'd like to welcome all of you to A World of Tomorrow, From Darkness to Light. It's the 12th edition of the School of Tomorrow events, and it's fully virtual, of course. The non-profit SOT event series was launched by Beacon House in the year 2000 as part of its corporate responsibility, social responsibility, and also to help inform the direction of the organization while also engaging global communities in conversations shaping the future of schools and societies. My name is Salima Hashmi, and I'm Professor Emeritus at the Beacon House National University in Lahore, Pakistan. The BNU, as it's popularly known as, was set up in 2003 and was the first liberal arts university of its kind in the private sector in Pakistan. And I was the founding dean of the School of Visual Arts and Design and continue to be associated with BNU. And it's my pleasure and my privilege to welcome you to this live session at the 12th edition of the School of Tomorrow events. The name of this session is Castles and Palaces as Museums, Navigating Between the Past, Present, and the Future. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to inform all our viewers that they may ask questions at any time using the question/comment function on the SOT website, or they can question or comment on the social media platform that they're currently using. And we'll address as many questions as possible during the last 10 or 12 minutes. So without much ado, I'd like to introduce my panelists. The first panelist, who I have to own very much so, because once upon a time, he actually took a drawing class with me. Mr. Attiq Ahmed, who's based in Lahore. He's an architect and he's an urban designer. And he's the principal at AEDL, which is a multidisciplinary design practice. He's the founding editor of the Office for Conservation and Community Outreach, which is known as OCO. And it's an urban design think and do tank, and it works on spatial analysis, it works on conservation and improvement of physical and social environments in urban areas and in heritage districts. Ahmed's work is very interesting because it pivots on a regionally expressive contemporary design response, but it's always informed and sensitive to the historic responses and keeps also in mind the available materials and, of course, the climate. Ahmed also designs and produces furniture under the label Turning Tables and teaches at the National College of Arts. I'm also very happy to welcome an old friend, Mr. Salman Beg, who is the CEO of the Aga Khan Cultural Services in Pakistan since October 1998, if I remember correctly. He has a very multifaceted background for what he's doing now, and a very diverse education, which includes almost a quarter of a century in the Army. He has a master's from the United States Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, and from the Lahore University of Management Sciences. He is committed to pursuing community-based development that allows for maintaining a fine balance between modernity and the environment, and integrating different development sectors with a focus on stimulating the local economy. And he is very well known for leading many initiatives in really conservation and transformation, not just of buildings, but of communities. So, museums. There are, according to Wikipedia or Google or whatever, more than perhaps 55,000 museums in the world, and probably more. And most children in school will, at some time or the other, if they're lucky, visit a museum. Museums, as we know them, they really began to be called that much later. They started around sort of the late 18th century, and continued until today. But I believe that there were museums before that, because they were places that were repositories of histories, cultural identities, and amazing artifacts for centuries before we ever heard of the word museum. These were the shrines, the temples, the mosques, the tombs, the churches, and so many other sites, which were really places where you found the most wonderful artifacts and you found human societies paying attention to them. Today, the museum has a very special place in human societies and in nations. And they are really the places which become uh, the go-to place for an understanding of who we were and who we are and perhaps what we can be. And therefore, I think it's best if we start with you, Attiq, because of the work that you have done, and also because of the fact that you're very clued into this idea of working in the framework of modernity. And we are talking about transformations of palaces and forts and sites like that into places for people, which can be called museums. So, I mean, what do you think? Firstly, what the requirements of museums are, and secondly, how do you go about this very sensitive task of trying to make a, very often a fragile heritage site into a place where the people throng?
Thank you, Professor Hashmi, for that very wonderful introduction. And it's a pleasure to be here. Um, I think, first of all, you hit the nail on the head when you said that museums essentially have a special place in human civilization. So, for me, the first requirement really is that museums shouldn't be islands. You mentioned the shrine, the mosque, or a very sort of public space, often being a museum in the past. And I think that is exactly what museums need to be. They shouldn't become islands, and they should be approachable, and they should be programmed in such a way that they involve the community, the city they're sited in different ways, attracting different age groups through different programming activities, etc. I think, however, the idea of turning specific heritage sites specifically into either museums or buildings that can be made into hotels. We've seen a very successful use of these sites in the northern areas. And we've actually seen that Baltic Fort was not just a conservation project in isolation, but it was actually, and of course, Salman Saab can shed more light on it and correct me if I'm wrong, but uh, I see the Baltic Fort as being part of a larger cultural framework, wherein the local community was also made cognizant of what their culture is, or what it was, and what it could be possibly. So I believe now the Altit Fort is also a sort of a restored place. There's a music conservancy right next to it and an orchard, and it's attracting a whole number of people. Salman sir, would that be a good site to turn into a museum?
Uh, Alted Fort actually is a museum, kept more in its, may I suggest, raw form. And the intention of museums, or shall we say, restoration on our part, on the part of the Arkan Trust for Culture, is really to carry forward the traditions or the values of the past, particularly in the sense of accumulated wisdom that has led to the formation or the construction of those very specific types of buildings, which are very much in harmony with the area, with the context, using local resources, and a balance with nature. And that's what we want to transfer ahead. And And your suggestion about Altat Fort, absolutely. For us, all these anchor points that we've done, whether it's the Baltic Fort that you mentioned, Altat, Sugar or Khaplu, are basically meant to take forward, as I mentioned, the accumulated wisdom of the past, which is central to the idea of these being these being channeled, as it were, between a past and a future generation, and to take that balance forward. And I think it has a great appeal these days. With climate change being a very hot topic these days. I think the use of vernacular traditional architecture, forms, materials is essential to my mind to see these as museums, but with a very relevant message about how to construct new buildings in the same manner, at least create an awareness and an education. So I'd like to turn back to Attiq and say, I hope that answers that part.
To what extent do you think the hotels involve the community or have had a positive sort of turnaround effect on the villages themselves?
Well, I think this question that you raise is something which is very close to my heart, and Salima talked about that as well a bit. About how do we really use all this to take forward. Let me go back and talk a little about about the vision of His Highness, and basically about the work that we do in the field of culture. Uh, yeah, you'll be glad to know the Al-Khan Development Network is possibly the only international network of agencies which has culture as a pillar for development. I know of no other such international bodies out there. And therefore, when we work up in Gilgit-Baltistan, which is a totally different context to, shall we say, the work that's happening in Lahore, which is very, very dense habitation out there. I think the common factor in both places is poverty, may I suggest, whether it's the walled city of Lahore or up there in the rural centers up in the north, the rural areas that we have. And therefore, what resources do we have there in those settings that we can turn into assets for the benefit of communities? So that's what we've tried to do. Talking very specifically of sugar, which I hope most of us will visit one of these days soon. Uh, Sugar is basically a heritage hotel and a museum. And the intention of it being a heritage hotel really was, compared to Baltic Fort, which is more of a museum and a cultural center, is because we don't have as many visitors going to Sugar compared to the ones going on the Karakoram highway and onto the Khunjira border. And therefore the reuse had to be a bit different. But you'll be very glad to know that only 1% of the revenues are retained by Serena, which is an AKDN partner which has specialization in this. Everything else goes back into the community. 30% of the profits go directly as finances back to the community for their use for socio-economic, cultural heritage development, etc. And they're doing a marvelous job. Let me add that. For example, the Sugar Town Management Development Society, when it received its share of the funds, so it was able to go back and restore one or rehabilitate or do repairs for an Amburik mosque project which had been done earlier. They're also using some of that money for a school that they've set up, for scholarships, for improving the school, etc. And also for doing this new Jamia Masjid that they've done. And you'll be glad to know using the carpentry skills that had come through in Sugar.
Fantastic.
I think that the question that I would like to ask both of you really, but first I'll ask Salman Saab, and that is that in all of this, one senses, and I've been to Altit and Baltit, is you sense that the museum, the palace, becomes a nucleus, but which radiates outwards, because the community seems to be actively involved. So we are talking now of a museum which is really a living museum because it's serving a community which is also a participant. And I'd like to comment on that because that obviously is a policy framework. I'm presuming that that was the policy.
Uh, Sorry,
Please,
Attiq, if you
Salman,
want.
sir, sorry.
Many, please do it.
I mean, for instance, I'd actually like to bring it back to you because when I visited the north about 20 years ago and lived there, um, culture was one word that you heard on every child's lips. You know, कि हमारा culture ये है, हमारा culture ये है, and I would sort of often wonder कि आपका culture क्या है? You know, is it the topi? Is it the wooden spoon? Is it the woven sort of sharma? What is the culture of the place? And it's been quite interesting how whatever we may outline as a culture in the northern areas, habits, of course, how people engage or interact with one another, these also, of course, form a part of that culture. Do you actually think that in a place like Lahore, this sort of framework is absent and actually needs to be worked on through education and exposure that starts at a very early age and engagement from all levels of society, really?
Uh, Again, if I were to talk a bit about this, uh, this has been a long process. It's not a process that can, hey, we put the start button on today and something will happen tomorrow. That's not how we see things working out in the real world, as it were. It has to be a long-term commitment, a long-term vision, and then you put in the shall we say, the processes and the approaches that can take you forward. Uh, if I can give you a little history back to the Baltic Fort itself. Uh, Basically, when His Highness Yahya Khan decided to restore the Baltic Fort, and this I'm talking of the late 80s, early 90s, the intention was that the Baltic Fort will be restored because it was falling apart, totally dilapidated, as it were, and every year it was suffering more and more loss. So the intention was, let's restore this, and that will hopefully rekindle pride and identity, give the local people a confidence in messages, their types of construction, which are very different to what you find down in the plains, as it were. Using a lot of this timber lacing, which I think you would understand much better. And that being a seismic zone, those buildings had kind of stuck around for 700 years, 500 years, and so on. So it was that idea to use that as a central figure for Central Huza, as it were. So when it came about, there was so much interest on what can happen next. How can it be an anchor point for socioeconomic development, for transformation, uh, and work on a number of levels, may I suggest. One is, of course, a very basic physical level or the material level. But I think there's a moral level and a spiritual level to all that. So you could find all of this happening up there. So the Baltic Fort became an anchor point for the whole historic settlement around that. And that led to, of course, an improvement in the living conditions for that area. And that's the vision or the context which has been carried forward to Altet, to Shigar, to Khaplu as well. As an anchor point, it is great for all this area of revitalization through communities, of course, full community engagement. Or we actually call it community-based conservation, because the benefits are really local. And the good part is, as you mentioned, the cuisine comes around that, the music, the dance, the embroidery work, and so on. All these elements come together. The dress, as it were. There's much more pride there out there, and I'm certain all those who travel up north do get a sense that there's something different about this place. There's something special about this place. There's a greater awareness about their own culture. And I suggest, more importantly, the values that are in Hunza or in Shigar or in the mountains, of frugality, for example, of confidence, of living in harmony with nature, are elements or values that come through as well. Uh, so coming to Lahore, I think we are at the start of that process. For ourselves, we came in here at the request of the government in 2007. So it's just been 13 years, but already, and I'm delighted to say so, the government, civil society, uh, individuals, school children, you name it, all the Ward City, the shopkeepers, the inhabitants there, the citizenry. I think they're all taken up with this idea of, hey, this is something great for us. Not just as a dead piece of architecture which is restored, but
Mm.
living and beneficial. And I think it gives them a great confidence out there.
We're talking, of course, about
Yeah.
an imperial city, a city which is, had centuries of feeling that it is the center for civilization of a particular kind. And we're talking about a part of the city which we very uh, proudly call the walled city of Lahore, because it does epitomize centuries first of habitation, but also an evolution of a society. And certainly, I'd say 30 years ago, one despaired because the city was in disarray
So,
and its whole systems had broken down in terms of all kinds of civic amenities, which were glaringly absent.
hmm.
And it was being overtaken by land grabbing, by mafia, and the most atrocious buildings, and a way of life was disappearing before our eyes, apart from the buildings that were disappearing from before our eyes. And therefore, I think it is worth looking at this situation today, because it, as you have said, it is somewhat changed. And there we have to, pay um, really tribute to the fact that certain individuals, certain initiatives, like the one of the Khan Cultural Services Program, came together. And I think starting with the Royal Baths, because that became a showpiece, which was a building for some other use,
Hmm.
but became a site for visiting. And of course, in a sense, it is a museum. And now your intervention, which is in the Lahore Fort. Attiq, you're an architect, okay?
Hmm.
And you probably can see glaring faults in all of this, things that could have been done better. But the fact remains that it has been done, and we have streets which have been conserved. And the people who were originally extremely hostile to this initiative
Yeah.
were won over, and they have become participants. So they give us some sort of an appraisal, if you like, of what you have seen happen. And I think you can have a critical voice, certainly, because we hope to learn from your critique. And just, the Lahore city, the walled city of Lahore, which we love, we live here, we are committed to it. And we want to see its palaces turn into museums, living museums for the benefit of all.
So I think that the wall city itself has basically become so radically transformed
Hmm.
that it really the only thing real about it is its footprint. And there is something more intangible there. There is still a sense of a culture of a specific place. But that is very sort of scant. You find that in very small, little sort of droplets of neighborhoods. But coming to the work that the Arhan Foundation has been doing in Lahore, it has to be said that the work is absolutely a massive step forward. And yes, whilst I may disagree with how the hammam itself has been programmed, and I might have problems with how the Wazir Khan's mosque has been cut off from the chalk where it once was a part of a much larger sort of urban ensemble. I think that the work happening at the fort is absolutely incredible. I had a chance to visit it recently with both Lashari Saab and with Wajahat Ali. And it was wonderful to see the problems that had been embedded into the building by various cycles of renovation and so called restoration are actually being tended to with meticulous care. A lot of the work that I saw being done was very unglamorous work. Water drains being rerouted, water cisterns coming in, and that I find very heartening because one of the major issues I've always had with conservation works in so far as, the glut of them that we see. Of course, Mohatta Palace in Karachi is an exception. The work that has happened in the north is an exception. The work at the Hammam and the fort is also an exception. And I look forward to seeing what will happen at Mariam Zamani's mosque. But of course, a critical question now arises with the Rim market. What happens to a bazaar that was allowed to sprout up and grow tentacles, as it were, economic tentacles? And I mean, it is a complete nuisance. It is bang in front of the Masjidi Darwaza. But where should these guys then be relocated? Should relocation also be a part of conservation?
Important question, very important question, is to, when people like yourselves are involved in conservation and transformation, which is what we're talking about, what do you do with the people who are going to need to go and do their business elsewhere? What do they offer? What do you offer them? Apart from, I think, the sheer economic benefits of, say, moving somewhere, surely you need to inculcate in them a pride of what they are moving, the reasons for which they are moving. That perhaps is a very major challenge, to make people own what is going to be eventually be an improvement. Because I think, Salman Sahab, I think that is something that you have accomplished in part of the old city.
Absolutely. And also in the north, I would say that the thing that I mentioned, the anecdote about every child having the word culture on their sort of brain, signifies for me a whole sort of push to take pride in where one was coming from.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, through various kinds of historic, political, social disruptions, our connection with our own sort of heritage in various ways, be it food, be it music, be it literature, be it architecture, be it simple everyday hellos. There has been a massive disruption. And of course, I wonder if conservation and cultural restoration can actually act as a kind of a hinge or a lever, to re-bridge, as it were, lost connections. Has it been achieved in the north, in your opinion?
That's pretty subjective, no? Because I might have a bias in saying, yes, I think we are on that journey. But have we achieved? Because I think the sense is you have a goal and you continue on that journey, and that journey, of course, has many turns and whatever to it. I think we are on the right track. I think we are moving forward. And I'd like to suggest that, particularly in areas where what I call modernity didn't arrive uh, as quickly as, shall we say, in Hunza, particularly Baltistan, given its remoteness, it being more cut off. The main road only came through between Gilgit and Sikado in the 80s. Uh, I think the impact has been much more benevolent and much more lasting. I think it has taken a firm root in the people themselves. Uh, Again, to give you an example of Shigar, which is in Baltistan, which is a very conservative society. It was so interesting and so encouraging to hear from the community leadership, particularly, of course, who represent the community, uh, that this is Sugar Town Management Development Society representing about 12,000 people of that area, who are elected, of course, through a democratic process. So what they said was that they were, in the case of Sugar, they were about to go ahead and build a new mosque, the Jamia Masjid. And they were going to do it using concrete, putting up minarets, domes, the traditional image that we have of a mosque. But when they saw the work that was going on on the Sugar Fort itself, where we were fortunate and there was this great positive response from the community, where we were able to revive carpentry skills, for example, and the use of local materials, whether it's popular wood, which some might think in other places is only good for matchsticks, but that's been a traditional wood up north. It's a separate genus up there. Using mud, using all this other local traditions of strengthening walls and etc. So when they looked at it and when they had enough of those skills, they said we'll build a new Jamia mosque in the old traditional manner. And the old traditional manner was really an evocation of the various influences that they've had. Influences such as the Tibetan influence, because when you go into Baltistan, you'll find the old mosques particularly have these what I call these Tibetan towers on top. They don't have domes. There are no minarets. But it was so good to hear from the community that they wanted to retain those influences and take pride and take those forward. So you can imagine that for us, I think that's really a transformative breakthrough, if I may use that word, in people valuing their own traditional or past heritage, as it were. The other aspect I'd like to mention is the school they've made there. They would invariably say, this community that, and we encourage communities to engage with each other. So this local community, the Sugar Town Management Development Society, went across to Hunza to meet people on their own. And when they came back, they said, what we need is, we are no worse than the Hunzukuts, the Hunzawalas. We are actually maybe better than them. And maybe they are. But they said the only loss or the only disadvantage they had was education had not been a priority so far. And all they said was they wanted education. The first priority was education. The second was education. The third was education. So that again was very heartwarming. And finally, we were able to get the Al Trust for Culture and the Italians to come and help out. And they said, we want a building done up using traditional materials. You'll again be very glad to know that 80% of the building materials, the cost that goes in, is local. So that, is so virtuous to the economy. So many more jobs happening. There's a livelihood thing, an economic transformation, as it were, revival out there. And may I say just the best part really was, when the classrooms opened up, they had both girls and boys studying, sitting in the same classrooms. Now, for me, that was the real breakthrough, really. So when we look at culture or when we look at heritage, I don't think we should limit it to just a building or a site, but I think we need to take a much more longer term view. It's basically just a stepping stone to something much larger, which is improving the quality of life. I'll be remiss not to mention that the Norwegian government, particularly the Royal Norwegian Embassy here in Islamabad, has been extremely supportive of the work that we've done up in the north and now in Lahore for over 25, 26 years now. And we feel that, and I think they feel very much as well, that this is money well spent, because I think it's a snowball thing out there.
I think what you said really is drawing us towards the notion of the museum as a starting point and just as a trigger, which can move outwards and then accomplish so many things. And Attiq, you mentioned that you've been looking at the work being done in the Lahore Fort, and I did too. And I stood, I think, for several hours watching the work being done on, the picture wall. And that is something that is a lesson to anybody who cares to spend some time there in the very painstaking conservation work, looking at what was there before and keeping it as it is, and yet, making sure that it doesn't deteriorate further. And you already mentioned that there are so many things that go beyond that. Where was the water? How is the water seeping into
Mm.
it? And so on and so forth. First, dealing with those issues. So you have everybody from various kinds of engineers, and we've had, I think, help from all parts of the world in this. But also, as you watch our local artists and artisans, technical people, learning, evolving, and also understanding how important this is to people who come, because people come and they just stare and are absolutely entranced by what
Mm.
they see. As a child, I saw that picture wall, and I'm very, very old now, and I have, wept as I saw the years, taking their toll on that wall. And I'm weeping now with joy when I see it coming back to its former glory. So I think that, what we've been talking about as a museum, whether it's a palace or it's a fort, it becomes so much more. It's extremely demanding of everybody because
Mm.
it wants things to come back. And we all know that that doesn't come easy. So that picture wall, I think, epitomizes really tremendous toil, tremendous imagination, and great aesthetics. So, I mean, Attiq, what were your feelings when you looked at, because you've been looking at more aspects really of the fort?
I would say that I was overjoyed, absolutely, very similar response to yours. And seeing again the delicacy of handling, that is what's most encouraging because, say, for instance, in Chakwal, we have Alauddin Khilji's tomb.
Mm.
Um, and that recently, no, I'm sorry, this was, I'm sorry, a Gharid's tomb, Shahabuddin Ghori. So it actually connects with the missile that we launched because Dr. Abdul Kadir Khan actually decided to sort of, in his largesse, restore this building. And I was horrified because I went there mid restoration and they were putting aluminium frames with tinted glass inside the Ivans. And, very thin sheets of marble were going up with oil painting being done on them. And I mean, it was horrifying, but it would be, something to add here that perhaps we don't really have a culture of delicate handling. We don't really have a culture of coexistence. Um, so, how do you actually then save something larger than a museum or a fort? Because everything that was quotidian, everything that isn't a monument simply gets washed over, built over, redone. And for me, what would be great is that the picture wall and the work at the fort actually acts as a similar trigger, how Baltic actually worked out for Hunza and the various sort of traders and market
Mm.
associations in the wall city who have disfigured its landscape and its environment completely would sort of think again and perhaps we can reconfigure the wall city.
I think what you're saying is very important because now you're talking about the intangibles that are connected to transformations, conservations, and rethinking what the purpose of a building can be. So we are talking about all of the other tiny, tiny components that build into cultural behavior and into social behavior into the way people carry themselves around these monuments, around these museums. One of the things that one notices always is the fact that these museums, whether they are in forts or palaces, or it's the Lahore Museum, for example, they are crowded with people
Hmm.
come from villages, who come from places which are not used to going to inverted commas
Hmm.
museums,
Hmm.
but they're drawn to these places. So perhaps, and this may be a long shot, but if even a few of them are able to be witness to the careful conservation that is going on, it might alter the way that social behavior occurs in these spaces. And I think you've looked at the way people behave in and around buildings, whether new ones or the older ones. And what are your thoughts on how this can that um, how they can alter the relationship between the human being and the building that they're entering or they're encountering.
So recently, our office was doing some work at Lahosmir Hospital, and it is Punjab's largest public hospital, Lahore's busiest. It was designed for a very small number of people, but facilitates roughly 200 times that. I mean, but in Mayo Hospital, what we noticed was that if we wanted to actually change the planning of the space, then we had to actually address the behavior of the doctors, the patients, the attendants who were coming. And we had to actually, first of all, factor in their needs. So we were working with an NGO, and they very correctly identified that GB should build a Musafir Khana. But to locate that Musafir Khana, it took me and my colleagues about a year and a half to convince everyone that no, let's not put the Musafir Khana front and center. Let's actually move it to the rear, because that way it connects between two existing facilities rather than serving one. So we did that. We successfully moved it, and then we were very sort of arduous in trying to convince people to build a courtyard, because everyone thought that if they would like to contribute to the functioning of a hospital, it should be towards the repair of a ward. And who needs a courtyard? But we built a courtyard, eventually put a small langargah over there as well. But I went there about 2 nights ago, and I was horrified to see that the proposal, as it was designed to connect between the emergency ward and the existing Ghadi ward, was thwarted because the space between the Musafir Khana and the emergency was now a parking lot. Uh, so institutional patronage and patronage from political figures, whether they're the governor or the chief minister or a minister for health, actually really matter hugely. We've also seen that when we built the Musafir Khana, people's behavior did change. They started sort of we designed it to serve basically a chadar, and we saw the chadar coming out full strength. Someone is sleeping, someone is eating lunch, someone's kid is just hanging out there, and it was great to see the space perform a multivalent function. And for conservation projects, I feel that all these heritage sites that we like to just cast in a single role as a park or as a backdrop, a kind of plastic, kind of scene that we need to take a selfie or an Instagram shot in front of. That kind of provokes a larger question. Do we as a society have the ability to see and cherish the assets that we have, whether they were built by Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, or Jains? And what do we do with them if we're not going to be simply consigning them to poetic decrepitude, then how do we meaningfully actually, for lack of a better word, appropriate them?
Yeah, quite right. I'd like to remind our viewers right here now that in case they want to ask any questions from the session, they can do it on their social media platforms or on the SOT Going on from there, I mean, you've mentioned two very, very major
Mm.
actors in our lives. The first is the automobile and its selfishness and the fact that it overtakes all kinds of spaces.
Yeah.
Um, and secondly, you've talked about the the mobile creature, which it's become an attachment to our our physique, and both of them, because they play such an important part in the environment, and especially where I know that where a lot of people are going to congregate, like in a museum, which is in a palace or it's in a fort, the kind of problems that the architect or the conservationist has to envisage, which are going to be the result of having these elements around us, and which cannot be wished away.
Yeah.
And therefore, I think that, and they have to be planned for. You have to understand that there are going to be all kinds of disasters which can possibly occur if they're not planned for. Salman, I'd just like to ask you about, did you have any of these issues, any of the projects that you were involved with, this business of what to do with, this kind of moving encroachment?
God. Absolutely, and I think the points that Attiq and you brought up about the parking element, as a society, and I think it becomes a societal thing. We really want to be the car that can get into the front gate if possible. Go and park there. I mean, that's a mindset. Unfortunately, we all have. How do we change that? Uh, I think, of course, education and maybe starting civics courses back in school again, which maybe we started, the newer generation didn't, is one aspect. Uh, but I think it falls to our lot really as civil society, uh, talking in partnership with the local communities, and of course with government facilitation and support, because I do not think it can be managed singly or on its own. To give you examples of Hunza, while it might sound very good, with the Baltic Fort and the Sugar Fort or the Altit Fort that we've been talking about, and that's an example that we need to follow. Yes, but having said that, the during the summers, the number of vehicles that start climbing up towards Baltit lead to traffic jams. I think last year, which is a good tourist season, there was a traffic jam for 2 hours. Can you beat it in Karimabad?
Wow.
So it comes back to that, where's that societal sense out there? And I think even more than that, I think we seriously need to, as in other words around us, where we need to manage things, we need to put in education and awareness, yes. But I think we also need to put in some proper measures of creating a parking space down there. And our suggestion to the government right now, even in Gilgit Baltistan, is that please do not allow any vehicle that comes up on the KKH, which is not from, shall we say, Karimabad or Altit, to move beyond the KKH. But then you need parking spaces where they park, and only local vehicles fly up and down, or they walk up and down, whatever. I think a similar story has to follow wherever Pakistanis live. I think is what I can say. Nothing special for our forts and castles, whatever. But I think it has to be done at that level. Only then will we be successful. Otherwise, the primacy of this local car, I think it's permeated all our senses at all levels. So all our efforts are just putting in these beautiful road spaces for private cars. I think it has to be a turnaround, seriously. And as far as when you come to within a location, I think there is an element, particularly with older buildings such as Baltit or Altit, we do charge a handsome amount as an entry fee. And that's done for a number of reasons. One, the first reason is, of course, these are fragile structures, 700 years old, 900 years old. We do not want too much of a footfall there. So that's one. And the other one is it keeps the crowds down then. It becomes a sort of a, they use the word, a mechanism to filter out those who are just there for, walking around, taking a selfie, scribbling on a wall, maybe, or whatever, uh, from those who are seriously interested to come and visit us. So maybe that's something that could be looked at as a possibility, because the more and more we engage with the Walled City Lahore Authority, and I can assure you that Mr. Kamran Lashari, for him, this is one of the major prime critical issues that he continuously talks about. And there's an effort on how do we go about and do this, because seriously, the other question really is, mass tourism. You have a huge mass of people coming to a place, or you've kind of filter that down. And while it might reek of class or whatever, but I think there needs to be some measures, some serious thinking which needs to go into that. And we need to do that. I mean, that's what I would say.
Okay, we have a question now. And the question is, do you see many art students opting for such projects of conservation and restoration work now? I'll ask that to you, Attiq. What do you think? Are there artists who are interested, or don't have to be only artists, they can be architects, they can be designers. Are they opting for projects like this? Are they interested in projects like this?
I'll refer to the picture wall project, which is populated by a team of very young and very dynamic people, led by actually someone who helped me in my thesis when I was a fifth-year student at NCA. So it's very heartening to see, for instance, a chemical conservationist, or I'm sorry, but the technical term, whatever it might be, to see ceramists,
Okay.
coming in, and various young architects who didn't really know that they had an interest in conservation, getting involved with the project through internships and drafting. I mean, I don't know if you remember, Salman sir, but my first foray into the Art and Cultural Services was as an intern in my third year at the NCA. And I literally learned how to document an old building. I mean, it took me a month and a half to document something like that. So I think restarting perhaps that in a really big way, where the AKCSB invites interns from all over different schools and colleges throughout the country, would be a start. Starting with Lahore, since you guys are already here, would be great. Um,
Yeah.
and then perhaps we can really see how well it acts as a stimulus for more students. But to answer the question briefly, I think there is an increase in interest.
Yeah. And this is linked to another question, that do you think that we as a society have the capacity and the ability to cherish our Sikh, Jain, and Buddhist treasures? That's
Salman
good.
sir,
Should I talk a little about the earlier question about many art students opting? It is so interesting. I think what has happened is when particularly youngsters, and I have a lot of hope and confidence in them, when they see this work ongoing, there is this interest. Not all of them, of course. It's a small number, but that number is good enough. But I think we are now getting to a stage where there's much more interest in doing work on heritage, the kind of work that we do. You'll be very glad to know that a number of skills have been revived. The ones on fresco or the wall paintings, for example, we had kind of lost it because it was the ustads who had done it earlier. But now We've been able to, through using international resources. I think that skill is now back up and alive and doing well, particularly in Lahore, for example. Similarly, other skills, So yes, we do all that. For us, going to these, not just sticking to Mughal monuments, as it were, or Muslim monuments, or whatever you want to call them. For us, when we work like in Gilgit Baltistan. Seriously, the khankas or the particularly, or the first masjid, for example, are really Buddhist structures which we help to restore. To my mind, I think they were kind of converted from there. Hey, there's a
Yes.
Buddhist structure now. Let's use it as a mosque or whatever. But for us, and more importantly, I think more than us as technical people or people involved in restoration work, I think it's the communities that need to take this on board. And I think they're doing it seriously. Seriously, particularly up in the north, they are. And and I think we'll see the same in Lahore, because as this work grows, as it spreads, as that awareness increases, and I think Salima, you had mentioned it, like when we started work initially in 2007, 8, whatever, there were actually banners out there in the walled city on the Shahi Guzargah which said, we don't want this, we want food or whatever, water or whatever. But now when you go there, I think there's an amazing amount of pride in the
Yes.
kind of work that's been done. And talking a bit about these spaces, the spaces that we've recovered, again in the walled city, the courtyard to the Wazir Khan Mosque itself, it used to be a place, and I was walking with Kamran Lashari, and he said, this was the garbage dump of the walled city, drug addicts, uh, all the refuse dumped there. And now when you go there, it's open for entry, but so much more cleaner. And the people around it really take pride in it. I think they respect it as a place. So if you can raise that level, uh, I think there's so much more possibilities. And so I end with a sense of great hope out there.
Yes, it is. And therefore, presumably, there will be no distinction between whether a treasured legacy is Jain or Sikh or Buddhist, because we have seen, the interest in the Sikh monuments in recent years, and hopefully the ongoing work to restore and conserve them. Again, hopefully with the help of local communities. I agree that the pride in what is happening overtakes other fears and suspicions, because Lahoris in particular take a great deal of pride in their city, sometimes in the wrong way. But I think basically we are people who are terribly welcoming. We look after our guests.
Yeah.
And if these guests come from various parts of the world to look for their own histories and their own artifacts, which were once upon a time, theirs, I think we will find that we will have done our job as Lahoris, and people like yourselves who are really, together with the citizens, stakeholders in ensuring that this work is ongoing. We have talked about histories, we've talked about the fact that museums are good for local economies, and we've certainly stressed over and over again the role in education, the vibrant role in education of museums at many levels, not just for school children, but for their parents also. And therefore, I think that our concern for museums when they are housed in forts and palaces redoubles, because we're looking after many more things than just artifacts. We're looking after continuation of values, of ways of life, and of the many memories of centuries gone by that make us what we are. Thank you all so much, and thank you for all of our viewers. We hope that you will be participants in your communities and in your museums for making sure that they are living spaces and not, as Henry Ford famously said, full of dead things, but they are living places.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Salima.